Good afternoon, everyone. This is chapter 3, The Plot Thickens, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's conversationalist. Ben Nicholson is an educator, essayist, activist, and celebrated draftsman. By that, I mean he can draw like an angel. He was educated at the Architectural Association, the Cooper Union, and Cranbrook, which, if I think about it, long before SciArc, was what we could call an American cousin of the AA in terms of being an innovative school. Ben is associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His publications include Appliance House and Thinking the Unthinkable House, published by the Renaissance Society in 1997. He has exhibited widely at the Foundation Cartier, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Venice Biennale. I know Ben from Cornell days. Ben has a long association with Cornell. He is currently Baird visiting professor at Cornell. It also happens, my mother and Ben grew up in the same small village of 500 people up in Fulbeck, where he's going to travel this afternoon and touch base back home. So it's a pleasure to have Ben here with us. His talk I've titled Edu-topia, the space of paradox versus the space of unadulterated hypocrisy, and that draws from an essay he wrote recently for a book on architectural education. Ben has in fact expanded that chapter for us today in a talk he'll provide for the first half of the hour, and then, as per usual now, we'll open it to the floor for a proper conversation. But please help me welcome Ben Nicholson.
Thanks very much. And of course, it is a real pleasure to stand in this hallowed room that has so much memories for us all. I'd like to flip out for you a piece of writing about education. And it's called We No Longer Know for Whom We Build. Today, a tidal wave of prescribed niceties is intertwined with the passing of architectural thought from one generation to another. Years ago, architecture schools worked with a loosely defined curricula from which the ebb and flow of thought could change direction at the drop of a hat. There now stands in its place the pedagogical contract, a document that mirrors the accreditation process and stands firm against a small army of litigious students who want to make damn sure they get what they pay for in writing. The curriculum has been replaced by a contract, and we follow it to the letter. Neorealist pedagogues have entered the fray and howl at open-ended musings over the long memory and wide generosity of architecture's fascination with social contracts vis-a-vis Blinkster building booms. The new classroom espouses back-to-basics nut and boltism, a little more than a different brand of the international style, albeit curvaceous. It touts big box capitalism for the trading of trinkets, packaging health and education, getting people from A to B that little bit faster, and of course, attending to the spiritual entertainment industrial complex. Baroque modernism, be it bendy wood in the Downs or rising phoenix-like from the silica chip factories up north in the Big Smoke, lives on. Over the past few years, those student projects that deal with all the stuff that is left out of the capitalist money stream have been lampooned as being irrelevant and a thorough waste of taxpayers' money. The last redoubt of ethicist educators is ridiculed for having nothing to do with architecture and being little more than a big wank-off. Who are those damn teachers who cannot conform to the current needs of the industry? Why are they questioning the very things that need to get done? It's like this. The first page of the morning newspaper deals with collapsed states, usually associated with black gold, blood diamonds, or blue scandal. Page 2 goes on to describe the feel-good perils of disturbing the natural order impacted by the political order mentioned on page 1. Page 3, well, let's forget about that for a minute and get on to page somewhere else. And there we find a host of home decorating tips, where to go for the weekend, and a lot has been left out. Now let's turn on the telly and do a little binge viewing on Netflix, sitting on the sofa all day, ripping through a year-long killer serial in 24 hours. What's up with all the doom and gloom shows, with swarms of zombies masquerading as a plain in sight societal meltdown of herbs Americana? On the one hand, Edu-topia is asking us to build for the legions of check shirt hipsters marching to the beat of the 1%, whilst the other 99 languish in the dungeons of circumstance, those newly branded, ungrateful global slaves of the 21st century. On the other hand, educators and educatees are brewing up visions of apocalyptical landscapes they consider to be the precursors of the inevitable Teotihuacan, the end of the world as we know it. It's fine to sit and watch Syria being torn to shreds on the 9 o'clock news, but doing something architecturally relevant for that is simply nuts. And anyway, what architect could ever forget the photograph of Palmyra's stones being atomized into a cloud of miniature marbles? What better way could there be for one's architectural career to go the way of history? So what's a kid to do in these best and worst of times? Thank God Charles Dickens found the words for the perilous situation that we still find ourselves in. We live, study, and work in the parallel worlds of the haves and the have-nots. And studying architecture at such a time is hazardous. We no longer know for whom we build. In the good old days, the educational mantra dealt with the space of theatricalities and paradox. But how do we now deal with the space of unadulterated hypocrisy, the kind that we are confronted with on a daily basis? I mean, how in all conscience can one design an immaculate wooden boathouse on the Thames whilst half the residents of the globe live on $2 a day? What kind of education could possibly prepare us for the wrenching hypocrisies that are necessary to take on board simply to get through to 6 p.m. without going crazy? Over the past decade, I have found it increasingly difficult to advocate a cheery-cheeked positivism that caters to the 1%. The benchmark for one of the architecture classes that I teach on geometry, tiles, and labyrinths is that the course could be useful to a student who may one day find himself or herself incarcerated in a supermax cell. What could you do all day in a 2 by 4 meter cell that would be meaningful? On the one hand, we have the space of liberty and freedom, and on the other hand is the space of enclosure and reduction. So what kind of education can we carry in our minds that would enable us to wander in both of these worlds, released of all constraint, and still be perfectly happy? I've always been impressed by the Islamic Haji, who goes to Mecca clad in 2 pieces of white cloth, the same 2 pieces for rich and poor alike. For a few hours each year, all the world's Hajis appear in exactly the same trappings. Of course, we all know that the oily rich slink back to their padded mini-Meccas overlooking the Kaaba to put their worlds to right after all the day's events. But surely something happens when you rub shoulders with your fellow human beings in a sea of similar cotton yardage. What's the thing about space in architecture being equivalent to love in poetry? That thing, whatever it is worth teaching. There, in the imagination, all is possible, irrespective of circumstance. In that construct of the mind, there is no need for a brick in the hand and a trowel of mortar. Instead, the body's feet shuffle in the dust and imprints the first architectural plan stored in the head that can be replicated the world over. The only tools we actually need are a couple of sticks and a length of twine, vine, or catgut. And if these are not available, then a handspan with a couple of fingers to act as compass points are perfectly adequate to build our dreams in the sand. All else tends to get in the way. It's eerily similar to the new digital dreams that hover beside us every minute of our waking night and day. That kind of architectural education would out nut and boltism, and any day of the week. Now that we are happy to go do yoga, tai chi, shiatsu, and run endless miles of marathons with gay abandon, perhaps it's time to make space for a contemplation of those parts of architectural education that remain repressed. It's time to demand space for the primal scream.
I first met Ben, as I said, at Cornell. I didn't get Ben until he came a second time, and I think these were interim reviews. And everyone was lined up to look at all the hard work. But unfortunately, the day before, there had been a suicide on campus. Architecture school sits on a cliff, and just down the road is this bridge, and a sublime drop of a waterfall. But unfortunately, it was one of 3 suicides that academic year, engineering students, who jumped from the bridge. Ben couldn't begin the critique of architectural work without acknowledging and letting the room remember what had just gone on outside. He sort of wondered how we could all sort of do the pantomime of the review. All dressed in black, he said, which was already a bad idea, and go through the exercise without stopping to see the bigger world. Not much of a bigger world, just the world down the street. Now, we could reflect back on what you said and acknowledge, well, even that scenario is all dressed up in a 1% frame. But I have to credit you with saying, we can't do this until we do that. We have to be conscious of something before we slip into this world of critique. You did go along with the review, but everyone left that day feeling quite different about the place than they might have done had you not brought that up. So I think your role as an educator is often to shake us awake, and the piece you just read is likewise. So thank you very much. I thought I'd turn to Mark Cousins to begin some dialogue with Ben on these topics, and to look at maybe some of the questions that fold back into your course. You mentioned geometries, tiles, and labyrinths.
I mean, I'm thinking initially of your question, like, for whom do we build? I don't think architects know, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, it's often kind of clouded by discussions of clients and whatever. Practical people from REBA will talk about what students have to know in order to be able to talk with a client. Whereas, of course, if you look at the education that people have at the AA, it's completely indifferent to any possible client. Indeed, it is deeply artificially opposed to architectural practice. If you think about it in the units, The sort of fiction is that the student is the author of their work, and except by the unit brief and the teacher, for the rest they're unconstrained. I mean, they're encouraged to be unconstrained. So for all this period in which they're a student, they are, as it were, the little prince or princess of design. Other people would be extremely critical of that. I mean, including kind of many people in the profession. What's the point of teaching people to be the little prince or princess of their design, when the reality is, when they go out there, they will have to, submit in some sense. Well, practice can look after itself. I just want to make the point that in a sense, this artificial being a prince and princess is the most incredibly valuable gift that the AA can kind of give them, if by prince and princess we mean in a fictional sense here, subjects of relative kind of freedom. Now, I guess the discussion often turns around the question how that highly artificial situation relates to something people call, examiners always use the term as if there's no problem with it when they get into the real world. Well, I don't know what the real world is, and I'm very fortunate I've never been there. It sounds quite ghastly to me. But, how would it improve students' capacity to submit if, as it were, the first agency that, the school itself taught them to submit? It's difficult enough, to use a paradox, teaching them to rebel. The problem of our societies is that actually people obey so easily and so fluently, they don't even know they're doing it. So I think really, I'm trying to kind of absorb some of what you say in terms of thinking about the education here. There is, this one privilege, like of the joint agreement that they should be as free as possible, on the generous wish that people who feel free are better trained through their freedom to do some good in the world. I mean, much better than those who are trained to do good. I mean, the problem with RIBA, the problem with go and look at the kind of mission statements of architectural schools. There is a ghastly humanist hysteria. Architecture is to make the world a better place. If you think that, it can only get worse. Architects are sort of like dimly aware that, when they think in terms of contradictions or polarities, like people often used to think that ugly was the opposite of beautiful or something like that. Architects kind of know that the category of utopia is not the opposite of dystopia, it's very, very close to it. And one would imagine that one purpose of the freedom of the student is to be highly suspicious of the programmatic doing good, which seems to recruit, or is the mission statement of RIBA and all the other places. Every time you read a mission statement like that, the reek of hypocrisy, and disingenuousness is completely overwhelming. Let me give you an example. We heard very indirectly, our graduate school, because we're not a university, has to be validated. It's validated by the Open University. In a letter to us recently, it dropped into the, oh, you've got an Iranian student. You can't have that. We don't take Iranian students anymore. What? So we informed them very politely that that would be a discrimination and a criminal offence. And anyway, the AA would have nothing to do with it. It turned out that at the OU, they've been doing a lot of e-education in the States, where according to their argument, they have to obey American jurisdiction, which was why 3 years ago they had problems with Cuban students. Now they don't have, but now they've signed up to something which is not even law yet. It's just Trump's mania of identifying Iran, Iraq, Syria, whatever. And the OU signs up to that. And then has the unspeakable nerve to try indirectly to kind of foist it on us. No, thank you. I mean, now you look up their mission statement, I did last week, it's page after weeping page of its utter and complete commitment to utter non-discrimination, to every democratic right, the right of inter, trans, whatever. It's the most, after all, any virtue at that length gets very boring. And it does. It's odd to think then that because we can't regard freedom as a norm, clearly in its distribution, it is a privilege. But it's a much happier privilege, indeed a much more powerful privilege, freedom, than trying to submit people to regimes of architectural virtue. I mean, if it's not actually the outright. I mean, the problem with neoliberalism is that the left, it seems to me, has a reason to always attribute to neoliberalism a kind of satanic intelligence. Sometimes, the important point is that they're just stupid. So I hope very much that the idea of possessing a privilege like freedom is absolutely fine, as long as you're concerned just to disseminate it. I mean, it's a bit like the one text, I think, that isn't troubled on socialism by recent events is actually Oscar Wilde's Soul of a Man Under Socialism, where he says that the rich are incredibly important in the development of socialism, in that it's their job to go and find out what's pleasurable so that we can immediately disseminate it to the poor. I mean, it's not entirely practical, but the point is, it's actually a happy thought. As is one, he starts off the evening lecture by saying, I myself, he says, would be a militant socialist, but I believe they have their meetings in the evening. Thank you.
I like the sheet that I'm required to sign. Item 4, the participant represents, warrants, and undertakes that. Item B, the content of the presentation shall not be defamatory or offensive. So I'm working about whether, have you signed this thing?
No, but I may be the cause of it being there.
Because, the notion of offense, we have to, according to AA law, I can't really say anything that's going to piss anybody off. I've signed it already, and I'm wondering whether to cross out the line offensive and then initial it. I think I will.
Someone wrote to me last year saying, very pompous letter, saying, I attend your lectures from time to time, not entirely without profit, he says. Thanks a lot. But I do wish you could exclude your continuous use of the word fuck during a lecture. I'm sure the audience would be, like as I would be, much relieved. So I just wrote back saying, fuck off. Yours insincerely.
And the place in this question of us and them and Oscar Wilde's Rich and the mass of humanity down in the factory floor. What I'm asking for myself and also for those with whom I work is to acknowledge both places and not like to start there and see their relative values and then start walking towards them. I think that I'm not so sure the words that you use, princes and princesses, is actually really helpful. I'm not asking for males or females or any of the blends. I have to be careful of 4B of ways of being, but I do think that if you start there with that kind of language, you perpetuate something that is really difficult to walk away from. And I do think language is extremely important. I'm horrified by the whole question of the politically correct. I mean, it's really tough in America. It's almost impossible to move anymore for a way of thinking about things. But I would say that we have to engage in what I'm struggling with forming the words for in a creative hypocrisy of finding a way to exist knowing that we absorb both parts of the strains. I mean, it may be that the forces of destruction and the forces of creation are old antagonists, but to be happy with, not happy, but to be able to negotiate the relationship between the two, I think is quite helpful. It's awful feeling like a hypocrite. If we're able to walk back from that and actually practice and educate and think as thinking people about how to eat a Mars bar and then go to the gym in the same day and feel perfectly good about it. If we can do that, then we can move forward. And in education, particularly of architecture, I think it is critical to be able to find a way to be at ease with both situations.
I mean, yes, I'm sure you're right about Prince and Princess, except I do remember at the AA, I had this Thai PhD student, and someone said one day, "Oh God, why do you call her princess?" She looked round and snarled, "'Cause I am." And she was.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just their kind of name. But I mean, I think that there is something kind of in what you say about language, which slightly turns on its head. I mean, in a sense, I fully advocate freedom. I've always been, under that. But as kind of Marx knew, there was something in the anachronism of the aristocracy that makes it a kind of almost a desirable object as opposed to the bourgeoisie. It has something, I think, to do with fairy tales and a connection to childhood that actually You know, it's strange, we've cut the heads off kings and things, but for children, these remain kind of important kind of nomenclatures. And so, I mean, I think my point is that the king or queen, the prince or princess, don't mean a royal family anymore. And they mean something in a world more. It comes to us as a world of children. And actually, it's a sort of happy simplicity, which, for the most part, I mean, like, as you say, through correctness, has almost gone. I mean, presumably soon in the States, children will just become politically incorrect. They talk about things, they refer to things, they think certain things are funny, and what's going to happen to them all?
I was thinking through this point about utopia and dystopia, the linking of them. If you look through our prospectus this year, Ben, half of the units, more or less, touch on one or the other. And I wonder if that's a symptom of something, or if that's a space that could be productive in your schema, where we could critique utopia, because it is rife, it is here, but it's probably at a lot of schools. And I don't know if that's a space where your own teaching dwells, or if you purposely reject this notion of utopia or dystopia.
Well, you know, I actually live in a utopia. I live in a town called New Harmony and moved there deliberately. It is also the crossroads of a fault line, a tornado alley, and a brutal river that floods. And I moved there deliberately for that as well. I'm looking for the triple header to happen, where my house shakes, the flood comes, and the winds tear its roof off. So in that respect, my practice is to be both the utopian as well as the one that is humbled by the inclement weather, and to figure out a way of living within that impossible puzzle. You know, my direction at the moment is to make some kind of sense of the urban and rural, can I use the F word, up, that happens in the United States. I find it absolutely fascinating. I'm actually working through guns to get there, and because that's the flashpoint, and studying, practicing, owning, writing about an icon. Now we get back to this whole question of the icon, the prince, the bellwether, the instrument that actually sets off the tinderbox. So, you know, once again, I don't know if anybody's got a unit that has both of those words in it. Is it either or is it or? And I have a suspicion that's probably people are working with dystopia, or probably they're working with utopia. I'm interested in the collision course between the two, and doing everything I can to find a place of being at ease within these extreme places. I mean, that's as far as I can get at the moment by living it out in person, and you know, reading as much as I can about it on the proverbial daily basis. You know, what I've been fascinated by in making a little brief preparation for this morning's talk is reading through the AA's history, 1847, the association, and then digging a little bit deeper into the notion of associations and cooperatives that were made by the working stiff in the mid and early 19th century, and how the decades of change of the Architectural Association have been so dramatic. Of, you know, the pre-war situation, the post-war situation, the 60s revolution situation, the Star International Architects situation. I mean, this school goes through these really dramatic changes where the student body, and perhaps with a little nudging by the director and the faculty, is all over the place regarding what the ethical stance is, or lack of ethical stance is, or does it really matter if there's an ethical stance? I mean, I find that's the big question for the AA, is in this kaleidoscope of ways of being, dare I call it a political point of view, what's going to happen next? Where's this ship steering to? And you know, to presume that it will remain in this you know, genteel state of you know, the comet's tail of the superstar is insane. It just is not going to happen. And where that crack point happens within the trajectory of the AA's role and position and sense of social responsibility or lack of it is really the question for me. I want to have some sense of being ready for it. Not knowing what it is, but simply being ready for it. And the passing into the nether regions of Zaha actually was a watershed moment. It was a big deal, that. Because in many respects, it's the end of an era. And I really feel that she has opened the field up again. And I'm grateful for that. And saddened, of course. But you know, I feel that the AA, in looking at its recent history and its past histories, is something's going to happen. It simply has to. This place is the bellwether of these changes. It always has been. And I can feel it, you know? I can feel it. Not that I know its intimate daily runnings, but certainly keep my ear to the nose, not nose so much, but more like ear to the grindstone. And I would say that the role of the educator is to make room for all of this stuff and frame it, but not lead it. Sorry, I don't believe in that kind of leadership.
I think with that sense of things being in the air, we all sense it in this room. I'd open up the floor without any kind of prompt. I think there's a discussion to be had in response to your remarks, and I think there must be a lot of feeling on this question of the political. So let's join in our conversation.
Have they signed this document?
Not one of those mothers has signed it. All right. Question in the back?
Yeah.
I was wondering, you started off by mentioning that we have, as architects, we're not so certain about who our client is.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if we could turn the question around in a sense and ask if you, as an educator, know who your client is.
That was your question. You want me to work on it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I just wonder what is, because I mean, ultimately we are a school, so we aren't actually in the building of business. We aren't in the business of building. We are in the business of kind of our product is the student, so to speak. So who then is your client, if you see what I mean? That I kind of get the sense from what Mark Cousins was saying that the caricature of the client is the princess or the prince. And if that isn't, without passing judgment, if that isn't adequate, or if those aren't the right words, then what are the words?
Yeah. I mean, the beauty of getting old is you actually forget what you're going to say. But I would say that, this question of who the client is and what the building's for and so forth. I mean, there's no question that there's no way you can work out what is going to happen to anything that you do. And it could go in any direction. I think that really is a given. But at least in the making of that thing, you can flip into the ethoscape through the building, or however you wish to do the drawings, or whatever you do. You can put a tinderbox of some sort, which can go in any direction. I mean, you look at the flight path of any building, and goodness me, it goes through a lot of rocky moments. I mean, America has just destroyed its public housing by dynamite and big, steel wrecking balls. A terrible tragedy. Not for the fact that it hadn't or didn't or should have or could have happened, but that we've lost something and we are left only with this memory. So I'm not going to say that you need to imagine what the world is going to be with your buildings. I'm just saying that to build with that sense of ethical wherewithal, where you're pitching all the bits of your culture into the task at hand and doing as good a job as possible, that's all we can do. It may be that some people are seers, and there are people who are seers, and they may be seers that it works in 40 years or 100 years or whatever. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, Frederick Kiesler, who actually built in New Harmony, believe it or not, he was a seer. And we're all indebted to him. Anybody who touches a B-spline is indebted to him. But it hasn't really been fully acknowledged what his contribution is, as if it matters. I actually believe in the anonymity of practice. I really believe it.
I mean, in respect to Sylvia's question, you kind of ask, who is the client of the teacher? I don't think the teacher has one. But actually the reason why is quite odd. I think the teacher is a servant, quite literally. Ought to be a servant. They're paid. If they serve the institution and the servants, and the students well, they're not doing it because you're the consumer. They're doing it because actually they have elected to teach. And actually within that, teaching is like their duty. That's why Hegel always makes the servant, in relation to the master, the servant is the one who knows.
Right. I would pitch it a little bit differently and say that the unspoken contract between teacher and student is that together you're going to find something out that wasn't known the day before. For me, if you know the answer to a question, it's not a question. It is an affirmation of your own knowledge. So, what I love about teaching is that those thoughts that I thought were about right just get slammed and reformed by that unruly pack of hounds that is ready to look for the weakness in any argument that you have. I feel that that's what great education is about, is that neither side knows what the outcome is prior to the engagement, and that together you will work it through. That it's really a question of mutual respect for both parties' point of view that can lead to something that neither knows about. And that's the place of a school that is really hopping. Actually, everybody's holding onto their chairseats because they have no idea what's going to happen next. And that together you work it through.
Fred,
Again, for me, it's like it's terms of language, of how you take those terms and pass them and figure out what it is that they are good for.
Frederick, a question, yeah.
I wanted to pick up on I might have misunderstood, but the kind of provocation in your talk on relating architectural education to place or to specific events. You bring up Palmyra and a few other examples, perhaps. And to the problem of the hypocrisy that can be created in a school like this, when an educational institution reacts to events that are very real and perhaps imposing themselves very directly on our lives. I wanted to bring up an example of a kind of height of hypocrisy that I experienced recently with a photographer who had met a Swedish architect who had won the equivalent of the Sterling Prize. And the photographer asked, "Could you smile for the picture, please?" And he said, "Architecture is way too serious to be smiling about." And he's only worked in that context. And I would see that as a kind of height of hypocrisy. You see a doctor would smile, perhaps, or other people have work that are perhaps a bit more serious in architecture even. So in the context of the AA that has famously been very pluralistic and been very good, I think, at dealing with hypocrisy. As in, you might have in one room someone dealing with something very, very real, and the people in the room next to them don't feel like they're not doing something valuable just because they're not saving lives or something like that. But I would perhaps see in our time now, perhaps in the last 10 years, a sort of reflective period where there's a stronger urgency, especially among young students, to feel the need for answering real-world problems. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how we can remain pluralistic and how we can have this kind of lively, hypocritical, let's say, approach to architecture that I think, at least I very much revere with the AA.
Well, look, on a practical level, if we're lucky enough, we're going to have a number of decades in our life. You don't have to do it all at once. You can spend a decade working on that and then another decade working on something else. As long as there is a spine behind all of those decades that you have an ethical stance. And it may show itself in one form or another. In 1 year, it may be going in that direction or another, but I think that the education of the architect is to set some coding in there that you can always go back to and have a sense of not having lost what it is that you set out to achieve. And as educators, I do think that dare I say, ethical stance is important. I really think so. I know it may sound like a bit of a detour, but where I live in New Harmony, kids are taught how to use guns. That's with bullets, not air guns or anything, at the age of 4. That they start learning how to shoot a gun as hipsters teach their kids violin in a Suzuki class. And they learn by the age of 11, 10, that actually the firearm is an instrument behind which you have to have an ethical stance. And that when city kids come to play the proverbial cowboys and Indians, terrorists and Marines or whatever you like to call it nowadays, the kids in the countryside, they can't point the gun at the other guy because you don't point guns at anybody. For me, that's an ethical stance with which there is a tool that is used. And I'm just wondering whether in our discipline we have our big word architecture over here that we field and we use, and it's practical and it's all of that. But unless there's something in there that allows us to know when to field it, we may get into trouble. And I would say that that's that kind of deep place that as educators we need to be concerned with. And I'm calling it that fuzzy thing that is not space, right? It's not love either. That's another one of those big words. But it's a something else, and that's the focus, is a something else. God only knows what to call it. But that's our lump of verdigris.
I mean, I'm much more skeptical about, like, the role of ethics. I mean, it seems to me, you know, maybe there's no connection, but like the invention of the mission statement, ever since then the world's got even worse. I mean, since the invention of ethics in the 18th century, there's a wonderful letter from a young woman who reads Kant, and she's 22, and she writes to Kant after he's published The Critique of Judgment, which is basically the invention of ethics in moral terms, in modern terms. She describes that she's married, but is bored with her husband, that she now has a lover, and she can't make up her mind what to do. Then she turns to Kant and she says, "And I read all the Critique of Judgment, and it didn't help me at all," which I think is the problem with ethics. You know, it sounds good to be in favor of it, because it sort of makes you sound like a bit nicer, but maybe we're not that nice.
Yeah, I mean, you've spoken about the power and necessity for freedom. And I would pitch the same kind of arguments to you about using a word that is all too easy to have go to hell in a handbasket. I mean, I think that all of these words, every one of them needs a lot of thought, and you know, settling on ethics being one that is either good or bad, or freedom is good or bad. I don't think it's the issue. I think the issue is to you know, to read deeply and think about these things in any way possible, and then finding a way between them. I'm just asking for not a median. I'm not interested in the median, because as you say, all you get is mission statements from shitty architecture schools, or good ones for that matter. They're both just as bad. But that there is a place whereby you acknowledge your own insanity.
Yeah, I mean...
That's all I'm asking for.
Well, because we're always, as it were, confronted, like with the very brilliant question, which philosophers don't ask, but it used to be asked by highwaymen, which is your money or your life. You know, in a sense, if you haven't got any money, what's the point of your life?
Cheating you.
But on the other hand, having money with no life doesn't make sense at all. So, you know, we should repay the highwayman a great deal of thought. I mean, you know, we are walking contradictions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've never had the good fortune to sit with you and talk about these stuff, but I have heard that you actually enjoy satire a great deal, which is one of my deep and abiding loves. And I would say that in this place of satire, you know, I'm not talking about glibness, I'm talking about places of design, places of art, whereby you never quite know where that thought is going, and that it could go there and it could go there, but it's up to you to be able to situate yourself to know where it is going to go. For you, that's different from mediocrity. And I think that you know, the role of the comic, the ridiculous and the sublime, is key for this conversation. I really believe it. And I you know, laughing is very important, and crying is as well.
In the time we have left, we want to take another question. Kate.
I'm really happy to hear you talk about satire. I think I was going to talk about the role of the absurd, or the acknowledgement, perhaps, of the absurd in architectural education, which I think is really important. And that perhaps actually the conflict is that in professional life, the architect is never allowed to have that uncertainty. The role of the architect is necessarily to simplify, to find solutions, to take a problem and be in absolute certainty about a solution to it. And I think one of the issues when we come to ask students or even tutors to deal with big, complex, difficult world issues is that we apply the same methodology, which is, I'm a problem solver, I'm an architect, I'm here to try and solve this. And for me, that's the fundamental mistake.
Breakdown.
That there's no acknowledgement of, like you say, the insanity, the absurdity, the contradiction. And to allow two contradicting opinions or views to exist in your work, I think is something that's not allowed in professional life, but it's something that's absolutely fundamental to academic life.
Do you want to say?
No.
Look, the great comic moment in classical architecture is the profile of the abacus. Whether that roof is going to squash the building or whether it's going to accelerate it out into the sky. That for me is a moment of incredible wit. And the reduction of that line, I mean, gazing at those abacus curves all over that part of Europe is so much fun because you can feel the wit. You can feel the tension of, is this thing going to go up or is it going to come down? And I would say that the architect actually has and does that in their building. They may go under the mask of pretending to be all, spit and polish and being super sensible. But the reality is that, you make a doorway, is it coming out? Is it going in? Is that window open or is it closed? And so there are all sorts of very, very subtle moves that you can do, even though you're in a place of imprisonment. My favorite movies are prison movies, because you find these personalities who are super smart and they figure out a way to live within the 2x4 meter cell. How do they do it? It's like, what tiny little split in this pie of what you call freedom are we able to exist in? And of course, it always happens. The human spirit can always find that place of freedom, irrespective of where they are. But I do believe that an education is helpful in order to be able to identify that and be at ease with it. I'm longing to go to prison. I just can't wait.
I must say the students and staff, particularly the units, know very well how to live in a 2x4 meter space. But I think to conclude, I would be remiss without noting that Ben is the only living link of our invitees to this conversation series who was here the last time this took place during our previous search. And I wanted to ask Ben for some parting words of advice as we launch into a search. If you think back to the state of affairs before, but as you say, you've taken the pulse today, where would you encourage us to pour our energies as we look toward determining the next phase of leadership at the Architectural Association?
Yeah. Well, I have implied it a little bit in this talk of just being ready for something that is not going to be easy to predict. I think that the key is to find a sort of brazenness that is willing to go there, even though you don't know where it is and what it's going to be. I would stay away from a point of view that is watertight. I think that's problematic, and I don't think that the AA has done that much over its. Well, I'm not so sure I can really speak to that, but I would say just to be ready, and to have the intellect that can grow whatever it is that is probably going to happen. I mean, what is fascinating to see is the number that there are now 15 Britishers here, whatever that means, and 85% globalists in this school. That's actually pretty fascinating. I'm not so sure that that has been pushed. And I think it should be. I think that the whole, AA is the finishing school for the global architectural elite, has really had its moment, and now let's get in there and actually make use of that incredible opportunity of all of this stuff that's going on. I mean, you've got a very powerful pool of thinkers and students and places. I mean, you were talking about place, right? We need to be able to transfer that notion of place from A to B and be comfortable in either place. So I would say that addressing that real pluralism, whatever that means, would be pretty interesting to do. I mean, if it's possible to have such a personality, maybe Martians or something like that could do it.
Well, that is pluralism. I would thank you very much, Ben, for your participation today, and encourage you all to join us tomorrow for Irene Sun-Woo, talking about the world of the AA outside of the academic year. See you then.
Okay.